Hello everyone, I'm Beardo, and I'm your host of MINUTIA MINUTE. This is episode 6, part 2, and I'm looking at a lot of pretty bad comics here. That's right, this is our worst of DC's New 52. Thank you for everyone who watched my last video. It ran really long. I wanted it to be like 15 to 20 minutes, and it ran for 28. So thanks for sticking through and watching it. I hope you enjoyed it. This video should be a little bit shorter. I cut out some of the awards just to be a little more succinct for you guys, so hopefully this one doesn't run as long. So let's get started right away. First of all, worst execution. What do I mean by that? Basically, you know, there are certain aspects that are applicable to all of the titles, and depending on how it was executed, it either was a detriment to all of the titles or a benefit to all of the titles. For example, costume design. All the costumes had to be redesigned, and is this something that was a general benefit to all the titles, or was it something that was a detriment? I would say it's a detriment, but it actually doesn't get worst of execution. I'm actually going to give it to the titles themselves. For example, Teen Titans here, I mean, all of the designs are like this. They're just clunky and very sort of Microsoft Paint-like, very computerized. You've got this silly two-tone that's supposed to make it fancy, but it really just looks cheap. I mean, I did stuff like this in 8th grade. I'm not a fan of it. It just really isn't very good at all. Let's see, another example, like the Legion title. The Legion of Superheroes, never mind the ugly cover, I mean the logo is just awful. Even tried and true titles like Green Lantern have that sort of two-tone split effect, and with like that really flat green, it just looks really bad. So titles all around in the DC New 52 looked bad. It could be the best comic book ever, and it didn't have a very good title. On the other hand, the general layout, where you have the DC Comics New 52, you have the color coding of the different categories, and then the big old number 1. I mean, that part is very appealing. I don't understand why the titles themselves all had to just look so bad. Justice League, I mean, says it all. It just looks terrible. Okay, that is worst execution. Next, I'm going to do the worst general category. If you remember from my last video, DC, if you didn't know already, split all of their titles into 6 or 7 different categories. The best category was the dark, and I think you already know what the worst of is because I have already discussed it at length in my other video. It is definitely all of the Young Justice titles. We've got Blue Beetle, Legion Lost, Legion of Superheroes, Static Shock. We've got Hawk and Dove. I think that might be all of them. Well, Teen Titans. Just generally, I mean, none of these titles, out of the 6 or so titles that were in it, none of them were really worth reading. Some of them more so than others. And I guarantee in our worst of video, we're going to be seeing most of these guys again. So, worst overall category, DC. Let's just cut the teens out. I know you're trying to get new readers, but this isn't the way to do it. Okay. Next, we are going to have our worst artist. This one is a fairly easy one, although there were 2 that I kind of wanted to give it to. One, when I started leafing through them, I was gonna do a tie. And I started leafing through them, and I was like, okay, the bad one is definitely the bad one. But I want to give an honorable mention, or a dishonorable mention to one, because it should have been much better. So we are going to start with the actual winner. Hawk and Dove. Because Rob Liefeld never fails to disappoint you. He is just such a lazy, horrible artist, just a relic of the 1990s. If my best person was Catwoman, or best artist on another video was Catwoman because of the facial expressions and the nuance and the acting you get out of the art, if that made it the best video, then there's no possible way Rob Liefeld couldn't get worse video, because this has the least number of expressions in any comic book that I've ever read. I didn't open up for the best videos because I wanted you to hear about it and then go buy it. I have to open these up just to prove to you how bad they are and warn you away. Okay, so you just look at the cover alone and it kind of says it all. You've got Hawk here, he's got this screaming look on his face. And then you have it again on the side. And that's pretty much what the book looks like. As you start leafing through, the very first time you see Hawk, he has exactly the same expression on his face that he did on the cover. Continuing forward to the next page, exactly the same expression, that screaming look. Then you actually have a little variation. He grits his teeth a couple of times on this page before he starts screaming again on the next page. That's down at the bottom. Hopefully you can see that. And I mean, you leaf through it, and it just continues. The next page, you have a total of Hawk screaming 4 times. 1, can't really see that one very well probably, but 2, 3, and 4. Just constantly screaming, you know, he is the bird of war, or whatever. I mean, it's just, he's either screaming or gritting his teeth. Which, I mean, in fighting, I can tolerate that. But then you get to just sort of the ordinary, like, just general talking, and they're, like, gritting their teeth. So, like, you know, Hawk will say, like, would you like a can of soup? But actually he says, would you like a can of soup? The way it's drawn. I mean, it's just so stupid. I can't stand it. I mean, look at this. Everyone, they're just talking, and they're gritting their teeth. It's just ridiculous. And then the icing on the cake is you get, I don't know much about Hawk and Dove, but I believe this is Condor, and you get Condor here, who is literally exactly the same as Hawk, except colored differently. I mean, his face is identical. I mean, how lazy is that? I don't know if that's intentional. Maybe you can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think it's probably lazy. So anyway, Hawk and Dove, definitely the worst part of the New 52. The runner-up goes to someone who the art wasn't very good. It was a lot better than Hawk and Dove, that's for sure, but it should have been much better. David Finch on Batman The Dark Knight. Now, the last Dark Knight series wasn't great. The art was more consistent. At least that's what I remember. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at them in a long time. But the art in this is just really terrible. You wouldn't expect it from the cover, but you open it up, and there's just a lot of bizarre dimensions, like the facial expressions especially. Either their eyes are too big, or too far apart, or his mouth is too big, or too small. It just looks rushed. I mean, even the very first image of Batman, he's just got this huge mouthful of teeth that just looks kind of strange. As you continue on, let's see if I can find a good one. This one, you know, just the way his eyes are, and the way his face or his mouth is at the bottom there, it just looks strange, and I can't quite put my finger on it. I feel like it probably was just rushed, but I mean, he looks like a frog here. I mean, it's just bizarre. The other problem is detail in this book. You could tell that the book was rushed based on some of the backgrounds. You've got, you know, almost a full page of Batman in front of this podium, or Bruce Wayne in front of a podium, with just a big W behind him. I mean, does that need a whole page? I mean, it's pretty easily drawn, and it just looks like filler to me, and not much work went into it other than drawing Bruce Wayne himself. So that kind of says a lot there. And then you spend about half the comic in this room where they're having a party, and there is basically, I mean, it's just a plain room, so there's not a whole lot to draw. So the artist has to say, you know, well, what can we do to bring this room to life, because we don't just want blank space. So the way they did it in this book was they had all these sort of caged windows. You can get a good look at them in the bottom there, up here, and I mean, that permeates half the comic book, are these caged windows, and it's just like, you know, what, I'm sitting here pretending to be David Finch, and I'm thinking, I'm in this room, I gotta fill it with something. What's something that's really quick to draw? Well, I can just draw some straight lines, you know what I mean? It just rings lazy. Lazy, sloppy, and undetailed. It gets better when you get to Arkham. You can see sort of the, you know, this is pretty cool. But, you know, it's half the book of filler before he took the time to really draw something cool. And I'm a firm believer that you know, it shouldn't only look cool if it's an action scene. You know, everything should look good. And, you know, you look at the cover and you've got this incredibly nuanced Gotham City. You know, even though it's the background, you've got these broken windows, and just all this little minutia goes into the cover to give Gotham City this whole look and feel behind Batman, the protagonist, who's really the main focus of your vision. But then you get into the comic book and it's just not there. I mean, compare Gotham City on the cover to the Gotham City on the big reveal splash page of Batman, and I mean, it looks fine, but there's really no detail. Nothing gives it any character. So, David Finch, if you're watching this, step up your game, because we know that you're better than this. I mean, I just lumped you in with Rob Liefeld. How does that make you feel? Okay, so next we're going to do Worst Writer. Now, this was a tough one because there wasn't anyone, like the people who wrote more than one book weren't consistently, like, each of their books were terrible. The people who wrote one book obviously was either good or not. So I have a couple nominations and we'll kind of decide. The first one is Paul Levitz. He only wrote one book, but it was definitely one of the worst of the New 52. Legion of Superheroes. However, unbeknownst to you, I actually have this in its own category, worst of. So we're going to give Levitz a pass on Worst Writer. But don't worry, we will talk about this book a little bit. The next person I have is Kyle Higgins. Neither of his books were terrible, they just were consistently not great, and he had 2 of them. So, again, it's the consistency that gets him nominated. Deathstroke and Nightwing were his 2 books, and Nightwing 1 actually was pretty good, although it's a little derivative of sort of Bat Family story kind of deal, and dwelling on the circus, I like that, but at the same time, again, it feels a little derivative. However, I did read issue 2, and you can't judge it based on issue 2, because we're judging the issue 1s, but he definitely, the book sort of becomes all over the place, and it's got a great narrative hook from what happened in Batman #1. So the reason why it's so narratively disjointed could be because the editorial staff wants him to take it one way, and he's trying to take it 2 ways at the same time. Either way, it just isn't really playing out for Nightwing, which is a shame, because this could be a really good book. The other one, Deathstroke, is by no means a bad book, but it's just kind of one note over and over again, which is, I'm Deathstroke, and I am a badass, and I'm old. Deal with it, you know? Which is fine, it's just I don't feel like that's going to sustain an entire series. I haven't read issue 2, but I hear it's just sort of more of the same. I just would want more from this book. So, Kyle Higgins is definitely nominated. I don't think we're actually going to give it to him. The person we're going to give it to is someone who is getting slightly grandfathered in from pre-New 52, because some of the work he did on before the relaunch I was not a fan of in the first place, so that definitely helps. But I'm going to give it to Mr. Tony Daniel. Tony Daniel, you can be a good artist sometimes, but you're just not the best writer, and I really wish you would just accept it. It's kind of like comedians who decide they want to take on dramatic roles. You've got the Bill Murray who did some bad dramatic roles early on, but then has sort of become more of a dramatic actor over time. But most of them, you know, like Jim Carrey, I mean, he just doesn't work in a serious role ever. And if he would just embrace, you know, what his talent is, it'd be better. Same kind of thing with Tony Daniel. If he spent more time drawing, his illustrations would get better because they've been hit and miss over time. And he'd just be able to focus on what he's really good at. Now, neither of these books were absolutely terrible. Again, kind of like with Kyle Higgins, they just should have been better, and they were consistently not great. Detective Comics I did enjoy, but I mean, it's very derivative. The Batman voice is what really does it. I mean, it's bad Frank Miller. And in an era where Frank Miller is his own bad Frank Miller, that's kind of saying a lot. And plus having Joker in the first issue, I mean, you're taking, you know, there's a reason they saved him for the Dark Knight in the new Batman series of movies. You know, he's the guy you save up, and he's a payoff character, you know? And instead you just kind of shot him off too soon. That's my opinion anyway. With Savage Hawkman, I'm not really a huge Hawkman guy. I didn't read Brightest Day because, I'm sorry, I'm sure it's a big waste of time. I knew that going in, and I couldn't get myself into it. Just 24 issues of money I just wasn't willing to spend. So I don't know a lot about this, but I do know that having the nth metal inside him is just a little too Blue Beetle, and that just seems kind of lazy in an editorial way. That might not be Tony Daniel's fault. It may be an editorial decision, but his name is on the cover, so I'm going to give it to him. Sorry, Tony Daniel. I think you can do good art sometimes, but your writing just has never been consistently solid. Okay, that's our worst artist, worst writer. Now we're going to do the worst revamped character. Now, as I said in my last video, there weren't really a lot of revamped characters. You had Captain Atom, Hawkman, Superman, there were a couple others, but for the most part it's kind of just a slight adjustment of the status quo. However, there was one that I definitely was disappointed in, and that actually was Captain Atom. Now, I don't think a lot of people really care much about Captain Atom in general. I enjoy this character, and I don't really have an explanation why. I just am drawn to him. I really don't know why. I think it was because I read when he crossed into the Wildstorm universe. That was kind of a fun tale, and I liked it. The problem with the Captain Atom, the new Captain Atom, is, for one thing, he looks too much like Firestorm with the flames coming off his head, and he has too many powers. I mean, I don't know what he can't do, especially after having read issue 2 now. I mean, his abilities are just so far-flung, and he has, a good Achilles heel, but it doesn't change the fact that I feel like it's kind of like Q in 007. It's like, if you need a gadget to get out of a problem, well, he just has that power, no problem. You know what I mean? I feel like he's undefined, just too broad. And in a new DCU where they're trying to make Superman more vulnerable, so he's more relatable, why are you transferring all of the woes of writing Superman onto the woes of writing Captain Atom? I don't know. I am actually still reading this book. I did pick up issue 2. I might pick up 3, but I probably shouldn't. I'm not quite sure why. I'm just lingering, wanting it to get better. Okay. Finally, we have the worst number 1. Now, as I said in my last video, it's not the worst overall comic, it's the worst number 1. What fails to introduce you to the characters, get you hooked on the story, what fails to draw you in. The whole point of the New 52 is to get you to pick up comics again. What title fails to do that? And I mentioned it already. Legion of Superheroes, you by all means deserve this. Paul Levitz. It's a shame because he's written Legion of Superheroes many times, and he's been working for DC for eons as an editor. You think that this should be a pretty surefire title, but instead it's just a mishmash of mess. You open it up, I mean, they introduce like 25 characters in a 20-page comic book. It's ridiculous. The very first page, you get the little bubble that says who the character is and what their power is, and where their home world is, I think. Yeah. So, you get 2 people on the first page, you get 3 people on the next page, and you think like, okay, well, they're going to introduce everybody, and then cycle back to them. But the problem is it just never stops. You start leafing through here, and you get halfway through the book, and they're literally introducing 5 people at a time. Now, I've never read Legion of Superheroes before. Well, I've read a couple issues, but I mean, I don't have the grounding to really get why I should care about these characters, and it really hurts the overall comic book. I mean, you don't care one way or the other. I mean, we're now 3/4 of the way through the comic book, and we've got 3 more characters introduced. I mean, come on. This is one of those titles where it would really benefit from that sort of fish out of water experience that you get with the character in Wonder Woman. Why Paul Levitz didn't do that here, I don't know, but definitely a big failure, big disappointment. I know there was some hype around Legion of Superheroes and Legion Lost, but neither of them really did it. They were just confusing. So, Legion of Superheroes, you're my worst number 1. Okay, so finally, we're going to skip ahead and do the worst in category. So if you remember from my last video, DC has all their titles broken into different categories, which is the overall worst one. It's Justice. So not surprisingly, that's going to be the title, or the section that's going to be the hardest to pick a single worst of issue. But We're gonna try. Okay, so of the titles that were there, the ones that really deserve it, Legion Lost could deserve it, but I'm only going to pick one Legion book. Legion of Superheroes definitely deserves it. Blue Beetle definitely deserves it. This title was just a rehash of the last title. I mean, you know, they just did this story 4 or 5 years ago, and they're doing it again for no reason. Not good. Don't like it. You should bring Ted Kord back. I miss him. I mean, I actually kind of enjoyed the old Blue Beetle series, but if you really want to redefine the character, let's have Ted Kord come back. I miss him. Okay, let's see. What else? Static Shock. Definitely a bad title. The main character is really, really annoying, and this comic book is filled with science jargon in the worst kind of way. It's the science jargon you get in Star Trek when they don't have a way to get the characters out of a situation. You just throw some science jargon at the audience and assume that that solves the problem when it just is meaningless. Static Shock, really, really bad title. Also really, really bad art. And let's see, finally, Hawk and Dove. Terrible art, not a great story, all around, not good. Of these 4 titles, I'm going to give Legion and Hawk and Dove a reprieve because we've already talked about them. I think we're going to have to give it to Static Shock. Blue Beetle was derivative. Static Shock was just obnoxious. Don't read this book. Okay, that's the worst of Young Justice. Now we also have to do Justice League, Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, The Dark, and The Edge. Let's start with Justice League. I admit I'm going to be picking this title up because I can't resist the draw of Jeff Johns and Jim Lee. But let's face it, it really wasn't a very good issue. Honestly, it kind of deserved worst writer because, I mean, it's a story that just kind of went nowhere. Justice League #1, I mean, this was supposed to be the big beginning, and instead it was just kind of a long teaser of what was to come. Which, I mean, I can appreciate it, but for $3.99, it should be a story, and it should have more than 20 pages, I'm sorry. You have the introduction of just a couple of people, which is fine. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that the whole thing takes place in one big fight scene. And it sort of tease the bad guy, but you don't really introduce a threat. So you tease the bad guy, which is awesome if you know anything about the DC universe, but if you're trying to get people to pick up #1s that have never read it before, you know, it doesn't have hold any water. Furthermore, the introduction of this guy, Cyborg, I wanted to say Cyclops, Cyborg, the introduction of Cyborg was just shoehorned in, especially if you don't know who Cyborg is already. So for being a #1 that's supposed to be, you know, you only have to know about Batman, it's just not very good. And it's definitely the worst of the Justice League titles. Unfortunately, it's the flagship. Okay, next we'll do Superman. What was the worst of the Superman titles? This was a tough one because actually I didn't mind any of the Superman titles. The one that gets it, and I don't seem to have it in front of me, but I'll just tell you what it is. Superboy didn't ring true to me. It was just a little too, again, I keep using this word, but derivative. How many times have you had him, you know, infiltrating the Teen Titans kind of plot? You know, it's just kind of boring. Also, he sort of suffers from Captain Adam's problem, which is he has too many powers, and his powers aren't well enough defined to really understand the character and what he can do. So for that reason, Superboy's the weakest title. I still kind of enjoyed it, but it just didn't quite do it for me, especially compared with some of the other titles. Next, we will do Batman. Now, there were a few bad titles, but there's really one that stands out to me. Batwing. It just was too much like Batman. You know what I mean? Just because it takes place in Africa doesn't mean it's original. You know, it's just too exactly like dark and brooding Batman that we've seen a lot of, and they're trying to get away from with Batman. Maybe they think Batwing is a substitute for that, but it just doesn't work for me. Also, the art by Ben Oliver should be awesome. You know, I mean, the artwork he does do in this is really, really good. The problem is the artwork that he doesn't do. I mean, there are so many instances, virtually the whole book, where, you know, you just rely too much on on the coloring to give you just a shiny light to sort of blot out all of the detail that you should be putting in the background. And you get this consistently throughout the whole book. You know, you get a little bit of grass underneath, but nothing in the background. And, you know, to a degree, I'm willing to concede that, yes, that's his style, but it just is too inconsistent, or too consistently non-existent. But, I mean, that said, I mean, he draws one mean-looking Batwing. I mean, look at Batwing on here. I mean, he looks really good. It's just, it feels hollow when put up against everything else. And you can kind of see even in the cover, it's like, what can I throw in the background? Some straight lines, you know? Anyway, same problem as the Dark Knight, really. Unfortunate. Also, the title, as I said, is generally just too much like Batman to really be justifiable. Batman the Dark Knight is another contender for this one, just because they're two Bat books we don't need in a DCU in which we have, what, 15 or 13 Bat books? I mean, that's a quarter of all the titles, so not necessary. Next we'll do Green Lantern. Now, Green Lantern is another one where most of the books were actually pretty good. I'm only going to be reading Green Lantern, but I would read some of the other ones. The one that really sticks out as a sore thumb of not being good enough is Red Lanterns. This is a book that I thought would be really easy to get right, but they don't. It's too much philosophizing, a lot of pontification from Mr. Atrocitus. And I mean, if I read a Red Lantern book, I mean, I want to see some gore and blood and just ripping people apart. Instead, I get him sort of whining about, oh, I'm not angry, I'm so sad actually now because I don't have any rage left. Why are you making a Red Lantern book about that? You know, I mean, it just, this would really benefit from the Deathstroke treatment of, you know, one note over and over again. Instead, they're trying to give it dimension, which, you know, I can't fault them for that. I mean, that's something they should do, but it just, long story short, really, is you probably just don't need a Red Lanterns book at all. So, okay, we'll do The Edge next. This one is a difficult one just because there are so many titles running across so many different genres. Generally, they were pretty good, though. The one that really stands out as bad is the Grifter book. I think I said in my last video, Wildstorm, really, the Wildstorm titles were kind of disappointing. Some of them were good, some of them were miss, and some of them were bad. This was the bad one. I don't understand why I care at all about Grifter. I don't know much about him, and he's supposed to be, you know, one of the better characters of Wildstorm, but in reading this book, I mean, you spend the whole book getting to him being Grifter. The problem is, despite that, I don't care about Grifter at all. I don't know why. He just didn't grab me at all. And, I mean, what makes his character special? He's got guns, like the Punisher. He's got a mask, like everyone else. All in all, really lackluster. Not impressed. Sorry. Worst of the Edge is Grifter. Okay. We've done Justice League, Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, Young Justice. Last we're gonna do The Dark, which was my best of category, and therefore it's gonna be hard to find a bad one. But through much deliberation, I did figure out which one would get it. It's going to go to Resurrection Man. Now, this book was by no means bad. I actually kind of enjoyed it. Although, of all of the titles, this one definitely had the most missed opportunities. I felt like a character who dies and is resurrected again over and over just could have a lot to say about life. Instead, he's just kind of a noir character, and it just fell short for me. That said, the plot was very good. I like that his soul is worth more because he never, you know, goes to heaven or hell. You know, that was very good. You know, plot-wise, this book is a success, but in terms of character development, I just feel like it could have gone a little bit further, had a little bit more of a message to it than what it did. So, overall, Resurrection Man, I'm going to give you the worst of the dark. Again, there's not a single dark book I wouldn't recommend, so still go pick this one up. Okay, so that concludes the worst of video. Really, overall, there weren't that many broken eggs. I think there were about 15 or so that like were definitely not picking up kind of titles. Out of 52, that's not too bad, especially considering that usually if you have one good thing, I mean, look at Hollywood. You got one really good movie, you have to go see about 25 bad movies, right? So, all in all, I'd say the new 52 was a success. Come back for part 3 of my video, in which I will rate everything into my definite pickups pile, my maybe pile, and then I'll just do a quick recap on the titles that you definitely don't need to be picking up. And then tune back in again, coming up for part 4, in which I'll have our Minutia Minute, which I'll tell you has something to do with Superman. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm hoping it's a little bit shorter than the last one. Thanks again for watching. Bye.